Hey guys, how you going? My name is Dom and today I'm going to be taking you through the basics of CSS. So before we get into the content, I just want to say you're going to need two prerequisites in order to follow along. First up, you're going to need to know basic knowledge of HTML. This includes things like tags, classes, and IDs. And secondly, I recommend you use Visual Studio Code just to make it easier while you are following along. So this video is going to be broken up into a couple of different parts. So firstly, we're going to take a look at a few key concepts, and then we're going to move on to creating an actual simple layout using the topics which we have learned. So we can see here, this is going to be the final design, which we are going to code from scratch. It is of course quite simple, but it's definitely going to help you understand, the basics of CSS. And before we start, just make sure to subscribe to Decode if you want to see more videos like this. I've got plenty of tutorials on my channel on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which you might be interested in. And one more quick thing, the source code for today's video is going to be linked below if you want to follow along while you are coding. Starting us off, we're going to take a look at the CSS syntax. So we can see here, the CSS syntax is broken down into three main components. The first one there on the first line is called the selector, and this right here just defines which HTML tags or elements you want to style up. The second line here is actually a CSS property, and of course there are many different CSS properties. This one here is called background color, and of course, as the name suggests, it's going to change the background color of the element which you are styling up. And the last line there is a comment, so of course inside here you can place whatever text you want just to aid you or the next developer on what's actually happening. So now we've seen the basic syntax of CSS, we can move on to how to actually include it in your HTML. Okay, so there are three main ways of doing so. The first one is called external, and this involves including an external style sheet which contains purely your CSS code, and that is going to be your preferred way of doing so. The next one is called internal, and this means that your CSS is kept directly within your HTML file itself. The last one is called inline, and inline means that your CSS is kept directly on the HTML tags or elements themselves. So we're going to have a look at all three right now. The first one is called external. So to specify or create a new external CSS style sheet, we can make a new directory right here called src, short for source, and inside here we can make a new file called main.css, and inside this CSS file will be all of the CSS for your HTML. So to include and tell your HTML to use this CSS style sheet, we need to go inside the head of the HTML, and we need to say right down here, creating a new link tag, we can say rel equal to style sheet, and then we can say for the href right here, we can simply specify the path of the CSS file. In this case, it's going to be src/main.css. Now also, just keep in mind that you can of course keep this file wherever you like. So now, if I save this, the HTML now knows to use this CSS style sheet for the page itself. So to test this is working, let's create a really basic CSS style. We're going to target the body right here, and we're going to say background-color is equal to red. So now, if I save this, we can see it changes to red. So now we know the CSS style sheet has been included correctly. So just make sure this is actually working on your side. Now, the next one is called internal. So internal CSS means that your CSS is kept inside a style tag. So let's make a new style tag right here in the HTML, and now we can basically specify everything that we included here inside the HTML itself within these style tags. So we're going to say body once again, then we're going to say background color and set this to be blue this time around. If I save this, we can see it changes to blue right there, so we know it is working perfectly fine. And that is your internal CSS right there. The last one is called inline. So inline CSS, like I mentioned earlier, involves putting your CSS directly on your tags themselves. So heading into the body tag right here, I can now say style and make this set to background-color equal to this time something like green. So now we can see setting the actual property directly. If I save this, we now get green right here in the browser. So that is your inline CSS. Now, keep in mind that you want to stay away from inline CSS where possible. It is simply, it can get difficult to maintain your CSS code when you have them directly on your elements, so it is best to use external over both of these two options right here. Now also, you may have noticed that it's actually picking the green color here as opposed to the blue or the red. So why is it using green instead of these two options right here, blue and red? Well, the reason is because when it comes to CSS, the inline CSS is considered first, followed by the internal and then the external. So of course, if I was to remove this inline CSS and press save, we can see it goes back to blue. So it goes inline, internal and external when it comes to the hierarchy right there. Okay, so now we can finally start writing some CSS. Okay, so we can see here I've got this HTML page, we've got this welcome text followed by 2 paragraphs. Okay, so we can see here on my H1 tag, I've got an ID of title right here. I've also got a class of body-text on the first paragraph only, and I've also got a couple of strong tags, one of them inside the first paragraph and the second one inside the second paragraph right down here. So let's use some CSS to, of course, style up these elements. Now, just keep in mind that before you can even start writing CSS, you need to understand, or you need to know, which elements or tags that you want to style up. Okay, so let's go inside the main CSS right here. Deciding which elements to style is done using what's known as CSS selectors. Okay, so the most basic form of CSS selectors is called the element selector. So this one here involves writing out your element's name. For example, if I say P right here, everything inside these curly brackets are going to apply to every single paragraph or P tag in the HTML page. So for example, if I say color and set the color to be something like blue, if I save this, we can see the text color changes to blue right there for every single paragraph tag on the page. In a similar fashion, if I make this, for example, H1 and make this color red, save this, and now we can see the color of the H1 changes to red. So that is your element selector. The next one to cover is going to be called the class selector. So this one here, as the name suggests, applies CSS to a particular class. So like we saw earlier, my paragraph has a class of body-text. So going back inside here, if I instead replace this P with dot and then body-text and I save this, we can see only the first paragraph with that class changes to blue right there. And that is done using the class selector. You put a dot followed by the name of your class. Next up, we've got the ID selector. Works in a very similar way. The ID selector works by ID. So I can say, for example, hash and then title. So hash is what you use for your IDs. If I save this now, we can see it only applies to those elements with an ID of title right there. Okay, so you can also apply your actual rules to multiple selectors. For example, if I put a comma, then I say right here, dot body-text, now the color of blue is going to apply to both of those selectors right there, the class and also the title. Now you can also even say something like this, where you put an asterisk, and the asterisk applies styles to every single element on the page. It is called the universal selector. And the last thing to cover when it comes to selectors is going to be what's known as the descendant selector. So this one here allows you to apply styles to children or descendants of a particular element. So for example, we can see I've got these strong tags right here. So if I want to say apply CSS to only this strong tag that exists within this class of body-text, we can do so. So let's go up here and we can target the body-text class once again, and now we can say, putting a space, we can then specify strong as the element selector. So now this just means that every single strong tag inside this class of body text applies to, is going to get this color applied. So if I save this, we can see only this strong tag, not this one, gets applied this style. So that is your selectors. I'm now going to show you a couple of common CSS properties which you might find yourself using quite often. So we can see here I've got this H1 and also this paragraph tag down here. So heading inside this main CSS, I'm going to target the paragraph tag. The first property to take a look at is called the font-family property. This one here allows you to specify the font family of your element. Okay, so for example, if I say sans serif right here and I save this, we can see the font family changes to be the default sans serif font set by the browser. This right here is going to change depending on the operating system and the browser. For example, in Chrome, the default sans serif font is called Arial. Now, if I want to actually specify a custom font right here, for example, if I say Tahoma, I can then put a comma. So now what's going to happen is the browser is going to look for the font of Tahoma on the user's computer. If it finds it, it's going to use Tahoma. If it can't find it, it's going to use sans serif after this comma. So saving this, we can see the font family changes to be Tahoma. If I make this, for example, dcode, of course, dcode isn't actually a font. So if I save this, it goes back to sans serif right here. So basically, you always want to set a fallback font right inside here when setting your font family. Typically as well, you're going to use a custom font right here. So if you want to learn how to include custom fonts on your web pages, I've got a whole video dedicated to that, which you can watch in the top right corner of this video right now. The next property is called font-weight. This one here allows you to change font to bold, for example. So if I make this bold and I save this, we can see the font weight changes to bold right here on the paragraph tag. Now, keep in mind that this font weight also has a numeric equivalent. So for example, bold also means 700. If I make this 700 and save, we can see nothing changes. So basically, when it comes to your font weights, 700 means bold and 400 means normal. If I save this, we can see it goes back to my default normal font weight. The same goes for normal because normal equals 400. Now, you may want to use a font weight of normal to revert things like headers. So for example, if I make this H1, because headings are bold by default, by setting this as being normal, you can bring the heading back to a normal font weight right there. Targeting back the paragraph tag, we can now explore the font-size property. This one here allows you to change the font size. For example, if I make this 20px, we can see the font size of the paragraph has changed to be a tiny bit bigger. If I make this 10px, it goes down a tiny bit smaller. So the default font size for your browsers is going to be 16px in most, if not all, cases. Okay, so that is your baseline. Now, one more thing to keep in mind is that sometimes you might see something like this, where it says 1.5 EM. So whenever you see this EM right here, this EM just means that I want to say 1.5 times the current font size. So basically, EM refers to the current font size. As the current font size by default is 16, 1.5 times 16 is going to be 24. This right here is 24px, okay? If I make this, for example, 2em, this means 2 times the current font size of 16. So now we get 32px right here. So that is what your em means. But typically, you're going to see px or em. Next up, we've got the border property. So the border property allows you to specify a border. I can say, for example, 2px, then solid, and then red. If I save this, we can see we get a 2-pixel solid red border around the paragraph tag. You can also change this to be, for example, dashed. If I save this, it now changes to a dashed border, but typically you're going to keep your actual border style to be solid right inside here. Save this, it goes back to solid. Next up, we have got the width property. So by setting the width, of course, to, for example, 200px, we can see we have no visual changes, but to better demonstrate this change, if I make this a background color of, for example, blue, and I save this, we can see we have that 200px width set against that paragraph tag. If I remove this width, it takes up the entire width of the page. So setting it back, we can see it is now limited. Now, we can also set a height property right here of, for example, let's just do once again, or you know what, let's do 300 px, and I save this, we can see it goes down to, of course, 300 pixels right there. Now also keep in mind that some elements can't actually be adjusted when it comes to the width and height. So for example, things like your paragraph tags, your divs, your h1 to h6, they are all what's known as block elements. So those can be styled, the width and height, but when it comes to your spans and your anchor tags, your links, things like that, they are inline elements, so you can't actually change the width and height of your inline elements. Just keep that in mind if it is not working for you. Next up, we have the padding property. So I might just change this background color to be cyan, and I'm going to apply some padding just like this to this paragraph tag. So I can say padding right here and make this 10px. If I save this, we can see we get 10 pixels of space between the text and the bounds of the element right there. So that is what's known as your padding. I've also got something called margin. So margin refers to essentially a very similar thing, but this time the space is on the outside of the element. So if I save this, we can see now we've got 10px of space on the outside of the element itself. So if I make this 50px, it's going to be more obvious. Save this, we can see there is now 50 pixels of space between the edges, left, top, right, and bottom right there. So those are some of your common properties which you might be using quite often. Next up, I want to show you what pseudo-classes are. Okay, so pseudo-classes allow you to change things depending on if something has happened. So for example, I can actually make it so when hovering over this H1 right here, I want to make the background color change to blue, for example. So I can do so using CSS pseudo-classes. And this right here is super important to making your websites look and feel really nice. Okay, so we can see here, of course, I've got this H1 with an ID of title, as well as this input field right down here. So let's go inside the main CSS right here, and we're going to target the ID of title. And then we're going to say :hover. So this :hover right here just refers to the hover pseudo class. There are many pseudo classes out there, but hover is one of the more common ones. Okay, so we can see here, we can specify some CSS rules. For example, if I say background color and make this blue, and I'm also going to say right here, setting a text color of, for example, white. If I save this, we can see upon hovering over the H1, it changes to a background color of blue and a text color of white right there. So that is the basics of your CSS pseudo classes. Okay. One of the other common pseudo classes is going to be called the focus pseudo class. So we can see here, I've got this input field, and we can actually use CSS to change the styles of the input field when it is given focus. So right now, for example. So going back inside here, I can target the input field and I can say :focus. So now inside here, I can say, for example, once again, background color, let's change this to be something like red. If I save this, we can now see upon giving this focus, it changes to red right there. So hover and focus are some of your more common CSS pseudo classes. Now that we've seen what CSS pseudo classes are, next up we can start talking about transitions. Okay, so transitions allow you to change the value of a CSS property in a smooth manner. For example, we can see I've got this button right here, and if I want to make it so when hovering over this button, I want the background color to change to red, but with a nice fade, I can do so using CSS transitions. So for example, let's go inside here. We can see I've got some basic styles applied to this button. I've changed the background color to be a light gray using a hexadecimal color right here. I've set no border and I've set some padding. So right here we can see I've set 10px of padding for the top and bottom, and then I've set 18px for the left and right. Then I've set a font weight of bold. So going down here, I'm going to say button, then I'm going to say :hover. Let's change the background color to be something like red when hovering over it. Let's save this. We can see it changes to red right here. So let's now add a nice smooth transition or animation to create a fade when hovering over your actual background color. So now let's go inside the button right here. We're going to specify transition. Then we're going to say background-color. So specifying the property right down here, the property to apply the transition to. Then putting a space, we can say, for example, 1s or 1 second. If I save this, now we can see it just means that it's going to take 1 second for this background color to change. Let's go over here, hover over the actual element. We can see right there it changes to red with a nice fade after 1 second has passed. We can of course make this, for example, 0.5 seconds to of course make it shorter. Save this, it is now a lot shorter. Now, what if I want to say also, what if I want to change the text color to be white when hovering over it? So for example, like this. Let's save this. We can see now that the actual color change of the text happens instantly compared to, of course, the background color. So to specify a second transition, this time applying to the color, we can also do so. We're going to say right here, using a comma, we can then say color and make this, for example, 3 seconds. So now saving this, we can see it'll now take 3 seconds for the text color to change to white and then vice versa. So that is your transitions right there. Okay, so next up, I want to have a chat about CSS positioning. Okay, so when I say positioning, I'm not referring to page layout. We're going to see more on page layout later on at the end of the video when developing that proper page layout. But now, when I say positioning, I'm referring to the CSS position property, because you're going to see the position property and things like position absolute and relative featured quite often online in CSS code examples and things like that. So we can see here I've got this div with an ID of outer right here for the outer box or div. I've got this second div right here with an ID of inner for, of course, the inner div inside here. So let's apply some CSS to these divs to make it a bit more obvious what's going on. So let's target the outer ID right here, and I'm going to say background-color and set this to be, for example, red. Let's save this and we get that red color right there. I'm also going to apply a width here of 200px and a height of also 200px right here. If I save this, it changes to, of course, that 200 by 200 box. Let's now target the inner div right here. Let's make this a background color of blue, for example, and let's make the width and height of this to be 50px, just like that. So now, of course, saving this, it's going to give us this right here. So let's use the position property in the outer div to change something around. So we're going to say position right here, and I'm going to set this to be absolute, because you're going to see this online, as you keep learning CSS, you're going to see this stuff come up. So if I save this, nothing currently happens. But if I now say top right here and set this to be, for example, let's just do 60px, and also let's set a right of, let's just do 100px. If I save this now, we can see it is changed position. So basically, this top right here is just saying, let's position the div 60 pixels from the top of the browser right inside here. The same thing goes for the right. Let's make this 100 pixels from the right. If I make this left, for example, then make this 0, and I save this, it is now going to be 0 pixels from the left of the browser screen, as we can see right there. So essentially, the position of absolute allows you to gain access to these properties right here. If I remove this position absolute, we can see those properties have no effect. So these top and left and bottom and right, they only work when you have position absolute or fixed, basically. So we're going to see fixed very shortly, but that is your position absolute. It just means let's position this according to the bounds of the actual browser itself. Next up, we've got the fixed property. So if I make this position fixed and save this, we can see nothing changes. But this just means that your element is going to float above everything else when you scroll down. For example, if I go back inside here and I apply a bunch of dummy text, I can say lorem ipsum and just keep doing this a few more times and save this. We can see when scrolling down, the box is going to stay right there. If I make this a position of absolute and I save this, we can see it's going to scroll up or scroll down as you, of course, scroll. So that is your difference there between absolute and fixed. So also keep in mind, you want to try and stay away from absolute positioning like this where possible, because it's going to be hard to maintain, especially when it comes to creating responsive websites for mobile phones. But your fixed positioning, because it's always going to be here, it's very helpful for navigation bars and headers, or even little floating icons and things like that. So you can use position fixed, but try and avoid position absolute. Now, there is one more thing to consider with this. It is useful, position absolute, when they are used in combination with position relative. So I'm going to explain this right now. Let's go back inside here and make all of these paragraphs go away. Then go back inside the CSS and we're going to remove all of these properties right here and make this position set to relative. So when you set this as being relative right here, we can see nothing changes on the page. As we can see, it goes back to its default position. So by setting relative by itself, nothing actually happens. But if I go down here now, inside the inner div, and I say position absolute, just like this, I can now once again, of course, use those top, left, bottom, right properties. So I can say here, for example, right, and make this something like 40px. If I now save this, as we can see, the inner div is 40px from the right of the container, outer div right there. If I remove this relative and save, it goes to the HTML page borders. So we can see here, when using absolute inside your inner, in combination with the relative in your outer, you can set things in the corners or at certain positions from the bounds of your outer container. I can say, for example, right 0, then bottom 0, to make the circle go in the bottom right corner right there. So that is your position absolute combined with position relative. Like I mentioned earlier, this right here should probably not be used for page layout, but more things like when you want to, do things like this. You want to make certain elements appear in the top left corner of other elements. This right here is super useful. Alright, so finishing up the main segments of today's video, we're going to have a look at the basics of what's known as CSS specificity. Okay, so when I say specificity, it sounds quite complex, but trust me, it's actually quite straightforward once you get the hang of it. Okay, so we can see right here, we've got this paragraph tag with an ID of my paragraph and a class of body-text. So let's apply some CSS to this paragraph tag. Go inside here and we can say P and make this, for example, a color of red. Let's save this, and of course the text color is going to change to red right here. Now, what if I also say down here, dot body-text, then I say color and make this blue. So of course, we're targeting the same paragraph tag, the first way with the element selector, the second way using the class selector. Of course, we've got this class right there, body text, set on the element. So now, saving this right here, we can see it changes to blue. So you might be thinking, well, how did it actually change to blue and why didn't it choose red? It might be because of the ordering. So for example, if I put the P down here below the body text of the class, you might think, well, of course, it's going to use red now. But no, if I save this, it still is blue. So it is not the ordering in which decides, which color to use. It's actually the selectors themselves. So we can see here, upon hovering over the paragraph tag in Visual Studio Code, we can see we have here this selector specificity. So we can see here, it is set to 0, 0, and 1 for the element selector right there. So basically, your element selectors are going to have a specificity of 0, 0, 1. 0, 0, 1 is smaller than the class, which gives you 0, 1, 0. Okay, so 0, 1, 0 is more than 001 when it comes to specificity. I won't go into detail what these actually mean, but basically just know that your second position right here in your trio of numbers is more powerful than your your last position right here. So that is why your color gets chosen. The same thing works for IDs. If I select the My Paragraph ID right here, and I make this, for example, something like a color of, let's just say green now, and save this, we can see it changes to green because the ID gives you 1 in the first trio, or sorry, the first position right here, giving you 1, 0, 0. Of course, 1, 0, 0 is more than 0, 1, 0. So green gets chosen right there. So that is your specificity. So with all this being said, the recommendation is going to be to try and avoid using IDs for your selectors. Try to stick to classes. That way you get less conflicts with your specificity. Okay, so if things aren't working, if you're struggling with, trying to decide between your different colors or whatever it might be, take a look at if you're using a class versus an ID. That might solve your problem. Now, there is one more thing to talk about here, and that is going to be important. Okay, so important looks like this. Let's add important, so exclamation mark, then important to the end of this color red. If I save this, it changes to red. So basically, you're important right here. First off, it's quite bad practice to use this. You want to use it only when you absolutely have to, but trust me, you want to try and avoid it. Instead of using important, try and fix your specificity first. So important just means that it's going to take precedence over even your ID of 1, 0, 0. It's going to take power over that. So that is why it's being red and not green in this case right here. But if I put important on this green as well, we can see it uses the green from here because they both have important, the specificity comes back and it says 1 here is more than 001 down here. So that is your specificity. Like I said, try and avoid using important when you can, but if you're struggling with your values, take a look at the class ID or element selector that you are using. Alright, so now that we've covered some of the basics of CSS, we can move on to actually designing a basic layout from scratch. Okay, so we can see here, this is what we're going to be creating right now. So it's quite straightforward, basic design. So we can see here I've got this index HTML and I've linked up once again the main CSS style sheet. So we're going to begin by writing out the HTML for our layout. So we can begin with a header tag inside here. And then we can specify an image. So we're going to say image right here, and this will be my dcode logo. So I've actually kept the logo inside the source directory also. We can see it is called decodelogo.png. So let's go back inside here and specify source, and then of course decodelogo.png inside here. Let's say decode logo as the alternate text. And now we're going to say a class of logo for this image tag right here. Okay, so now we can move on to the main content of the page. So I'll just zoom out right here as we can see something like that. So moving on to the main content, let's go down here and specify a new main tag, and then we're going to specify also a div with a class of container. So basically this class of container is going to be a div which has a maximum width on it, and it's also going to be centered, and we're going to see how that works later on when we get to the CSS. Inside here though, we can specify a new h1 with a class of heading. Then of course we can say, for example, welcome to decode inside here. Let's move down and specify a paragraph tag and put some dummy text inside here. I'm just going to copy and paste some text from the actual example. So I'll copy this right here and just paste it inside the text editor. And we have this right here. If I save this, we of course get this result right down here. Now we can specify a second header. We're going to say h3 with a class of heading. Inside here we can say, for example, what do we offer? Just like that. And now of course, once again, let's add some more paragraph tags right down here. And now we can get to the actual button. So we can see here on the example, we've got this button which says see our products. So let's go down here. We're actually going to be using a link or anchor tag to achieve this button. So we're going to take the link and convert it into a button using CSS. we're going to say a right here with an href of hash just to go to nowhere. Then we're going to say inside here, see our products. If I save this, we of course get this right down here, see our products. Now the reason why we're using our anchor tag instead of an actual button tag is because this needs to be a link, it needs to go somewhere, so of course anchor tag is better suited to doing so. Next up, we've got the main footer, so let's go down here below the main tag, and we're going to say footer inside here, and then we're going to once again use the container class with a div right here. And also inside here, we're going to say and copy, and we'll just say copyright 2021 example. If I save this, we of course get that right down there. So now let's use CSS to style up the HTML. So going inside the CSS right here, the very first thing to say is going to be to target the body tag right here. So by default, the browser is going to add about 5 pixels of margin around the actual HTML body. So we can say margin right here and make this 0. If I save this, we can see this space right here goes away. If I save that, the space goes away right there. We can also specify a font family of, let's just do sans serif, just to make it look a bit nicer. Save this, the font family changes. So also keep in mind that this font family here is going to cascade down and apply to everything inside the HTML, as we can see right here with the paragraph tags and the heading tags right there. So let's move on to styling up the header. So for the header itself, we can firstly just say a position of fixed. So keep in mind that when I say header, it refers to essentially the main green bar on top, which contains the actual logo. So let's target the header right here, and let's say a position of fixed. That way it's going to float above everything else. We're going to also say a top of 0 and a left of 0 to position it in the top left corner. If I save this, nothing much happens, but we can see the logo is now floating on top of everything else. We can also give this a height of 70px right here, as well as a width of 100%. That way, the header takes up the entire width of the page. Save this, and this happens, not too much. Let's set a background color to be 009578. Once again, using a hexadecimal color for the background color right there. If I save this, we get that nice green background color. We can also say right down here, a box-shadow, and this property here allows you to specify as it suggests a box shadow. So we're going to say 00, then 5px, then we can say RGBA, then 000, 0.5. So this right here looks a bit confusing, but trust me, it's quite straightforward. Basically, this 0 and 0 refers to the top and left offsets for the shadow. So basically, we're saying 0, 0 to make the shadow appear in the absolute center of the element. We're saying 5px for the shadow size, and then RGBA 000, 0.5 for the shadow color. So basically, we're saying give me a fully black color for the shadow 000 and a 0.5 opacity to make it 50% opaque, giving us that slight and subtle gray shadow right there. Okay, moving on, let's target the actual logo itself that sits within the container or within the header. We can say here a height of 100%. If I save this, we can see the logo is now the full height of the actual header instead of being a lot larger. Now we can see there's actually no space around the actual logo. So let's go inside here. Let's add some padding. We're going to say 10px for the top and bottom, then 15px for the left and right. Save this, and we get that space right there. But we can see the logo is now taking up too much space, and it's actually overflowed across the actual header. So it's gone a bit wild. So let's bring it back to being inside the header by specifying a box sizing here, a box sizing of border box. So what this is, the actual border box here, means that when I apply some padding, I want the height to include that padding. So if I save this now, essentially the height of the logo is 100%. So we're going to take 70 right here. But then this 10px top and bottom padding is going to be subtracted from that 70. So now basically the logo height is 50 because border box is going to include the padding in that height. Keep that in mind. Next up, we can target the main right here, so the actual main content. For this, we're going to say firstly a margin top of 70px. Why? Because if I save this, we can see the heading right here comes back. Okay, so the heading of Welcome to Decode comes back. It was previously hidden behind the actual header or the banner up top. Okay, we can also say a font size here of 20px just to increase the overall font size of the elements on the actual main section. Then we can say right down here just a color or text color of 333 for a dark gray. Now we get this result right here. As we can see, when setting a font size of 20px, obviously the heading is actually larger than the paragraph, so this right here isn't 20, but it is using the relative unit which I showed you earlier, that EM, to say the heading is basically 1.5 times the current font size of 20px. 1.5 times 20 is of course 30, so basically this heading is going to be 30px, or whatever it might be. Of course, depends on the actual size. So, moving on, let's target the class of container. So for the container, we're going to say here, first off, a padding of 2em. As we know, the container is within the main right here, so we can see that padding of 2em, or 2 times 20px for the current font size, gives us essentially 40 pixels on the left, top, right and bottom of the main content within the container. So of course we get that space right there. Also, if I zoom out right here, so for example, if I'm on some massive, big monitor, we can see the text takes up the entire width of the page. So this right here can actually be, quite hard to read on those widescreen monitors. So to fix that, let's restrict the width of the actual container. So we're going to set a max width here to be something like 1200px. If I save this, it is now reduced massively, but unfortunately, it is still to the left. So let's move all this stuff right here in the middle. Let's do this using a margin of 0 auto. So a margin of 0 and then auto just means that we want it to be centered. If I save this, it gives us that centering right there. Now also, I want to mention that this max width right here is just saying it's going to try to take up 1200px, but if it can't, it's going to be reduced. So this makes it perfect for mobile friendliness and compatibility. If I, for example, try to impersonate a mobile phone by making this smaller, we can see the content is going to shrink down and the actual width of the container is being dynamically updated as I resize the browser window to pretend to be a mobile phone. But also, if I zoom out, it's going to be capped at 1200, as we can see right there, to cater also for those desktop users. Moving on, we can target the heading right here. For each one of these headings, we're going to simply say a color of using a dark blue. We're going to say #252 and then C6A for that blue color. And we get this right here, as we can see. Let's now move on to targeting or styling up the actual button right down here. So we're going to say button, then we're going to say, first off, a background color. Let's make the background color #5662 and then CE for light blue right there. We're going to set the text color to be white, just like that. Let's say text decoration of none. So a text decoration of none is going to remove the default underline set by the anchor tag. Let's save this and we get nothing. Let's figure out why. It's going to be the class. So let's add the class on the href right here, or on the actual anchor tag. Let's add the class of button to, of course, convert it into a button in the CSS. So now save this and that class of button is being applied. So we get this result in the browser just down here. So now let's move on and we can say padding. Let's make this 10px top and bottom and then 15px left and right, and we get this right here. Let's set a border dash radius to be 5px. Border radius allows you to specify rounded corners of, in this case, 5px. Save this and we get this right here. So now we're going to target the button once again. This time we're going to say : hover before, of course, hovering over the button. Let's change the background color to be the blue used before, of course a darker blue compared to the one specified right here. So now hovering over it gives us that dark blue color. And let's also add a transition here of background color. And we're just going to say something like 0.5 seconds to give us that nice smooth fade when hovering over the actual button. And the last part of today's video is going to be targeting the footer, so targeting the footer tag right here. And then of course every single paragraph that exists inside the footer, let's add a color of CCC right here to make it of course a light gray. And we don't get that working. Let's try and figure out why. It is because we need to actually put the paragraph inside the container right here, just like this. And now saving this will give us that nice gray copyright on the bottom. So there it is. That is your basic layout using CSS. And there we go. And that is going to conclude today's video on CSS. Once again, if you guys want, subscribe to Decode. I've got plenty of videos on my channel just like this. I hope today's video could help you in some way. If it did, fantastic. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.